So good morning. We are back on the Sermon on the Mount, getting toward the end of chapter 5. And remember, the idea of the Sermon on the Mount, from what we've seen, is that at least part of it, Jesus is refuting what some of the scribes and Pharisees and rabbis, how they had misapplied, misinterpreted, misused God's word. And so he is setting things straight as to how God wants Christ's disciples to live. And our key verse has been Matthew 5, verse 20. I'll go back and read it again like we have been. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. And so he is again pointing out what that looks like. What it looks like for his disciples to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. Because it's essential for them if they want to enter the kingdom of heaven, he says. And so he talks about murder. And a lot of these, notice that this goes to the person's spirit and attitude and motivation. He talks about murder beginning in the heart. Talks about adultery beginning in the heart. Talks about what marriage is supposed to be. Last week we talked about Jesus, how he talked about oaths and the truth and being honest and all of that. And so now this gets us to verse 38. So we'll read verses 38 through 42. So Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. Whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away." So he starts out with this Old Testament precept or principle of retaliation, the law of retaliation. There's a phrase for that in Latin. I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but it is this idea of, like he says, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So let's go back to Deuteronomy 19. And we'll see where we need to start. Deuteronomy 19, I think it's around verse 16. Deuteronomy 19. Starts with witnesses. Deuteronomy 19:16. If a false witness rises against any man to testify against him of wrongdoing, then both men in the controversy shall stand before the Lord, before the priest and the judges who serve in those days. And the judges shall make careful inquiry. And indeed, if the witness is a false witness who has testified falsely against his brother, then you shall do to him as he is thought to have done to his brother. So you shall put away the evil from among you, and those who remain shall hear and fear, and hereafter they shall not again commit such evil among you. Your eye shall not pity. Life shall be for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. And of course, there are other places in the Old Testament that give that same law of retaliation. It's found in a number of places. But when you read that, and something that's really, really important was that this was all done before the court. In other words, this wasn't personal. One person didn't decide to do it to another. This was, they went before the judges, the court, the officials, and the officials had to hear all of this. So it wasn't, this law of retaliation wasn't, well, someone cut off my foot, so I'm going to go cut off his foot. No, there was a whole system that they had to go through before these judges. And then if the judges, like we read, after careful inquiry to see if, this was really happened, was it intentional, was it unintentional, so on. Then if the judges, the court decided that yes, this law of retaliation was to go in effect, then it could happen. But it was not supposed to be some sort of personal vengeance ever. And that is really important. And it wasn't, and I think we can get the wrong idea, this was really a merciful law. In other words, if someone, say, struck you and you lost an eye, well, you couldn't, and if the court said, yes, this really happened, and you can take his eye, you couldn't take both of his eyes. So in other words, it limited the punishment. That's why it talked about, as we read, an eye for an eye. It wasn't an eye for two eyes or a hand for two hands. There was a limit. So there was a degree of mercy involved in this law of retaliation. They could not go beyond what the law said. And so this law was this was something that was put in place to be fair. I mean, this law is found in Exodus, it's found in Leviticus, so it's found in a lot of places. And so the law was a good law in that sense. It was a good law. There wasn't anything wrong with the law. And this law was just. Again, it was, and let's read, this goes right along with it. Someone read for us Hebrews 2, chapter 2, verse 2. I think that's the right verse. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 2.
For if the word spoken through angels proved terribly unalterable, and every transgression and disobedience received a just unalterable.
That's right. Every transgression and disobedience received a just reward, a just recompense. So this is the idea of this law of retaliation. It was just. And again, it was merciful because there was restraint put on the avenger. He could not go beyond. Okay? If someone knocked one of his teeth out, he could only retaliate and knock one tooth out of the other person. Not 2, 3, or 4. Just one. And so it was, in part, a way to protect. There was this idea of protection involved in this law of retaliation. And, of course, it was necessary, like Jesus says in verse 39, tell you not to resist an evil person. Not to resist an evil person. And so it was something that was just, it was beneficial, it was merciful, it was something that was very necessary. All right. Then he says in verse 39, whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. Okay, this is, and he's going to go on and talk about the second mile. Okay, and of course we have to keep this in context. Also, look at the rest of the New Testament. We can't just take these verses and forget about everything else. You know, we have to look at the whole teaching about this throughout the New Testament. And of course, we can't take everything super literal. You know, he had just talked about, what verse was it? Verse 30, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. Well, that's not literal. All right? So a lot of these goes back to what I had mentioned. It was about the spirit and attitude and motivations of the people. Jesus is stressing inner holiness. And that's where it has to start. It's not just about observing these outward actions. It's about what's on the inside of you. You know, that's what's on the inside of you. And that's about this law of retaliation is the same thing. So he says, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. Okay? This is not some sort of, you're walking down an alley and someone hits you up the side of the head. That's not what he's talking about. Because most people are right-handed. I'll go back, most normal people, right-handed. So a right-handed slap, okay, if you're going to slap somebody on the right cheek, all right, you're not going to slap them with this. If you're right-handed, you're not going to slap them with this because that's very awkward. It's going to be a backhanded slap, like that. That's an insult. When you slap somebody like that, that's an insult, and that's what he's talking about here. You know, an insult is slapping someone on your right cheek. So you're insulting them by doing that. And, you know, maybe you're showing, you know, there's contempt, maybe disdain, hatred, okay, by being slapped on the right cheek. That's what they're showing. And very possible maybe this is because of your faith. You know, maybe they don't like you because of your beliefs. And so this slap is their way of showing how they don't like your beliefs. They don't like your faith. They're showing contempt for what you believe. And so Jesus says, and this goes back to your attitude. This goes back to your attitude. If that's why you're being slapped, all right, not being attacked in a dark alley, but if you're being insulted because of your faith, don't insult them back. You know, absorb that insult, all right? People, you know, just look at Christ and all that he absorbed because of what he taught. That's what he's teaching his disciples. You know, have the right attitude toward people who don't believe what you believe. All right? Don't seek to avenge them. You know, if you have to, swallow your pride might be another way of expressing you. So that's why he says, turn the other one to him also. That's just saying, again, this insult, this showing of contempt for who you are or how you act and behave, you know, don't let that turn you into something you don't want to become. You know, he's stressing that inward holiness again. So, be the right kind of person. You know, don't feel like you have to get even over every little insult that happens. Because if you do, you'll eventually, that's what you'll do all the time. That's all you'll be concerned about. Well, somebody insulted me again. Well, I'm going to get back to them. I'm going to take my vengeance on them. All right? So by showing that individual that you're not retaliating with hate or, you know, contempt for them, then maybe they will see why you have the beliefs that you have. That's why that's so important. So he's certainly not saying, you know, if someone wants to take your life, let him. That's not what he's saying at all. And, you know, we certainly have the law of self-preservation ourselves and taking care of us and others. But if it's just a slap on the cheek, you know, that's a pretty small offense. That's a pretty small injury. So, you know, try and get even. Don't try to take vengeance over something that is small. All right? Show the right kind of heart. Show the right kind of spirit and attitude. Show the attitude that Jesus had when he was slapped. He says, show that spirit. Show that attitude. And maybe, if you show the right attitude, then maybe that person will listen to you when you have a chance to explain why you believe what you believe. But if you come back and slap the person back and show contempt for them, they're certainly not going to listen to you. And I think that's something to take from these first couple of verses. He goes on, same idea. This is all still the same idea. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. Again, this is what is your attitude? All right? It certainly doesn't mean you can never sue someone, because that's not what he's talking about. At that time, if you sued someone in the first century and you sued them to take their shirt, you couldn't take their cloak. That wasn't allowed in the court system in the first century. You could sue them for their shirt, not their cloak. So Jesus says, if that would happen, if they want to have the cloak, give them the cloak. Give it to them. And see, that's going back to the last verse, hopefully that will point them to Christ. Point them to, why do you have this attitude? Okay? You're not going to be, this person sued you for whatever reason, and again, maybe it was because of your faith again. Well, they got your shirt. Okay, give them your shirt. And if somehow they sue and get your cloak, fine. It's just a material thing. Hopefully, they will see something very special, in your reactions. God has appointed the civil government to be avengers. He has appointed us to be avengers. And God takes vengeance on people through that civil government. That goes back to Romans chapter 12 and talks about, God has appointed civil governments. They don't bear the sword in vain. That's their job, is to administer justice. That doesn't mean they always get it right, but it does mean that that is how God wants this to happen. He wants civil government to take that role. Well, then he goes a couple of other places and says, and whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. In the first century, a Roman soldier could force a person to compel a person to carry a load for 1 mile. And some of the Jews in the first century would measure that mile out exactly and not go a tiny bit beyond it. So for Christians, for disciples, Jesus is encouraging us to, even under suffering and persecution, encouraging us to have the right attitude. So he says, if he compels you to go 1, okay, go with them 2. That's not going to destroy you. That's not going to hurt you having to go an extra mile. You can do that. It's not, Jesus, I think, wants us to practice, it's not all about me. You can give up some personal liberties sometimes if you have the opportunity to use that to tell others about your faith. And that's a good way to do it. So if he wants to, if you were in the first century and you were a disciple and the Roman soldier said, okay, you're going to carry this load for a mile, you agree to do it, your attitude in doing it is what's important. How do you do it? Are you grumbling and complaining the whole 1 mile? Or are you trying to show that Christ-like, spirit while you're doing it? And then, if there's a possibility he needs another mile, be glad to do it. So it goes it goes back to that motive. It goes back to your spirit, your attitude, your motivation for why you do things. Well, then he ends up, give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. This is about being generous, but also being wise. Would someone read Luke 6:35? While we're on this, we're just about out of time, but Luke 6, verse 35.
But love your enemies, do good and lend, hoping for nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you'll be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the unthankful and evil. He is kind to the unthankful and evil.
This goes back to, I think, what he's talking about here. Show the right spirit to people, even if they show contempt for your beliefs and your faith. Because most people do not follow Christ. Most people, don't become Christians. Most people don't live like Christ wants them to, but he still blesses them. Still gives them, like Luke 6:35 said. He still provides good things for them. So Jesus says, I want you to be like that. I want you, even if people are ugly and rude and hateful, that's no reason for you to become just like them. That's the religion of the second line. It's not all about you and what you need, but be generous, but of course be wise. You can't give away everything you own. Again, this goes back to, you have to look at what the entire New Testament teaches. So this whole section here, 38 through 42, I think stresses this idea of what kind of attitude do you have to your enemies. And of course, that's how he's going to finish the chapter, Lord willing, next week, is about loving your enemies. I think that's got to be one of the hardest things in our lives to do. Love people who don't love us, who actually show contempt and hatred toward us. Loving them, very difficult, but that's what Jesus says, that's your goal, in other words. So, well, I'm glad you were here. I talk nonstop pretty much. I do that sometimes. But Lord willing, we will get into the end of that chapter where he talks about, this is the epitome of what he wants. Loving your enemies.